All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Garage Gym Athlete podcast. We're diving back in to our programming series. This is the hard to kill programming methodology, and it is the perfect blend of performance and longevity, ultimately what we're trying to do. So I'm going to jump straight in. Very brief recap. We've gone through the strength continuum, which is strength, speed, strength, and speed. And we've also gone through the endurance continuum: aerobic endurance, muscular endurance, strength endurance, power endurance. What you'll notice about those two continuums is we covered 8 areas, okay? And in those 8 areas, we were predominantly looking at types of muscle contractions or strength training. If you just think about the entire strength training, all of that is how to get stronger, how to get faster, dynamic efforts, those kind of things. Then we get into the endurance continuum. And other than aerobic endurance, we talk about muscular endurance, strength endurance, power endurance. So those are all lifting methods. Those are all strength methods other than aerobic endurance. Now, when we talk about aerobic endurance, in that continuum, I was primarily talking about zone 2 training or base training because it lays the foundation for everything else. Now we get into energy system training. So there are 3 energy systems that we're going to be talking about and that we program at Garage Gym Athlete. It's, in all honesty, one of my favorite topics because I love specifically training energy systems and what it can actually do for your training. And so we're going to start kind of in reverse order. And so there are 3 energy systems, like I said: alactic, lactic, and oxidative. And they have other names, but we're going to start with the oxidative system or your aerobic system. We call this sustain. Okay, so real quick, you might be thinking, wait, we already talked about aerobic endurance. How is training your oxidative or sustain or aerobic system going to be any different? Well, if you think about it, if you were going to try and improve your aerobic endurance, like say I want to go run an ultra marathon, a 5K, it doesn't really matter what it is, some endurance event, I can't just go do zone 2 training every damn day. Like I just can't, that's not going to be very effective. You're like laying the base without ever doing any of the hard work, the threshold training, the VO2 max training, anything of those things. All you're ever doing is zone 2 training. Zone 2 training is great, but it's not what's going to get you any kind of, higher end performance, faster marathon times, faster 5-mile times, 1-mile times. That's not what's going to do it. It's really just laying the base. So when we specifically talk about oxidative training and energy system training, and this is specific to Garage Gym Athlete because a lot of people use this in many different ways, we are talking about higher end aerobic threshold training, interval training specifically, and how to improve it. And there's even a third modality we'll get into before this series is over that shows how we're hitting the aerobic system in 3 different ways because it's that freaking important. Okay, so the oxidative system, if you were to look at energy system training, just big picture here, like what is it? What are we talking about? Well, when we're talking about energy systems, we're really talking about how the body utilizes energy to produce, how it utilizes different forms of energy to produce power, to produce output. And the lower in time and higher intensity, you're going to be predominantly using sugars, okay? And then as you move away from that and you extend time and you, move away from the intensity, you're going to primarily be using fat. Now, that's kind of in a vacuum. Like when you're training less than 10 seconds, these like high bursts that we'll get into energy system training, that's without oxygen. Really, it's stored, ATP, those kind of things. We're not really worried about the macronutrients that we're consuming for a workout. But when we're talking about energy system training, we're talking about how you metabolize different forms of energy and how that translates to your training without trying to overcomplicate it. So when we're talking about oxidative, we're typically talking about longer duration and lower intensity, but not necessarily low intensity, like not hard. What I mean by low intensity is it's not glycolytic. It's not these really, really hard efforts. Okay, so what does this look like? Predominantly for us, a Garage Gym Athlete, when we are doing oxidative training, the main thing that we are trying to adhere to are standard work to rest ratios. Now, this is across the board. How you should train energy systems is targeting specific work to rest ratios. When you're looking at the oxidative system, your aerobic system, you should be looking at 1-to-1 or 1-to-2. So what does that look like? Well, if I want to go 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off, that's how we're starting to train the aerobic, the oxidative system. Or it could be 1-to-2. So we could do 3 minutes on, 6 minutes off. Okay. And the more time you have off, what does that typically mean? That means you should have gone harder in the training. And typically these intervals are going to be anywhere from 3 to 8 minutes in duration. That's going to kind of be, I mean, you can go up, you can go 10 minutes on, 10 minutes off. You can do any kind of combination you want, but typically in our training, 3 to 8 minutes. And so when we go to program this, I want you to just think about the 1-to-1 versus 1-to-2. So if I'm doing let's say 8 minutes on, 8 minutes off, 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off, it doesn't matter. 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off, any of those things. If I'm trying to stick within that 3 to 8 minutes, then that's going to dictate the intensity. Now, I'm not going to give you a specific heart rate zone, but knowing that like, hey, I'm going to go hard for 5 minutes, and then after this, I get a full 5-minute break, you should know that you can probably go pretty hard on those 5 minutes. Like you're going to be an upper threshold, high zone 3, low zone 4, something like that. Now, if I say, hey, I want you to go 3 minutes on and we're going to rest for 6 minutes, that should be a bigger indicator of bringing even more intensity, right? So now we're high zone 4. We're really trying to push the pedal to the metal. This is threshold training. This is really like VO2 max level training. And then you're going to take 6 minutes off. That means you're basically getting a full recovery. And so the expectation is to go really hard. And the reason I have to talk about this blending of time and intensity and all these kind of things is because if you don't do this correctly, if you mess around with energy systems and you're just like, oh, well, Jerred said if it's a 1-to-1 work to rest, so I'm doing 1 minute on, 1 minute off, which is also correct. Like you could do 1 minute on and 1 minute off. But if you are either going way too hard or not hard enough, you're like not in the right zone. You're not training how you should be. And predominantly what I see is not someone going too hard. It's not going hard enough. So it's like, okay, I'm going 1 minute on, 1 minute off. That should be a pretty taxing session. And you'd probably do that for 30 or 40 minutes, maybe even longer. But if you are like, well, I'm going, you're hitting zone 2 level intensities from 1 minute on, 1 minute off, that's not exactly, checking the box here from the oxidative training standpoint. That's more of like base training, zone 2 aerobic endurance. You can do that somewhere else. And for us, we would have already planned that for you, programmed it for you somewhere else in that training block. But when we get to the oxidative, when you start to see these intervals, you just have to know that there's a certain level of intensity attached to it to make sure that you're seeing the results. So if I'm going 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off, I know that that's all right. That's like my 80%, 85%. And now I see 3 minutes on, 6 minutes off. I'm going to that 1-to-2. All right, now I'm bringing up 90, 94, 95%. I'm going to go pretty hard on these 3 minutes. And then you might do a series of these. So it is interval training. It wouldn't just be 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off, and then you're done. It would be doing that for 3, 4, 5, 6 sets. And typically you would, say you did 3 sets of that this week, you do 4 sets of it next week, 5 sets of it the week after that, and then maybe back off, and then, maybe change up the time domain. But that is it for opening things up with energy system trainings. There's a lot to unpack in energy system training, but if you just know, you need to be looking at work to rest ratios, and we're just talking about oxidative right now. There are 2 more energy systems to hit. And then you also know, hey, we're predominantly using more fat when we're in the oxidative system, so the intensity doesn't have to be at our absolute highest level. That's when we get to the glycolytic, and we'll talk about that. That is how the body is utilizing energy. It's predominantly doing that through, oxygen. It needs oxygen to continue to create that energy, and it's relying on a mix of carbohydrates and fats that your body has stored ultimately to to unlock, these carbon chains that are eventually going to be turned into energy that you use. But energy systems are one of my favorite topics, and I can't wait to dive into them more. But this is the oxidative system. And if you are one of our athletes, you're very familiar with training with this, and we appreciate you for sticking with us, being a part of our training. If you would rather not have to worry about all the things that I'm talking about, you're like, man, can I just have someone do this for me? Absolutely. Go to garagegymathlete.com, sign up for a free trial, and we would love to have you. But that's it for this one. Remember, if you don't kill comfort, comfort will kill you.